Hi, Henry. How you doing?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Well, actually, I've been a little sick the last few days, so I'm feeling a little under the weather, and the weather is just awful as well.
That's exactly right. This is not the best time to be feeling under the weather, given how spectacularly miserable it looks outside. But I understand it's even worse in other parts of the country.
Yeah. There's always somebody who's doing worse than you that makes you feel a little bit better, I guess. But if I'm not my regular ebullient self,
okay,
you'll know why. Or if I, like, if you hear like a crashing sound of a head hitting a keyboard, it's not because you're boring me. It's just because I passed out for some other reason.
Okay, well, ebullience is a pretty good segue into our first topic, because I understand you've done more on the happiness issue since we talked last time.
That's right. Thanks for giving me the chance to plug what I've been doing lately, Henry. I have a new paper out from the Cato Institute that was released last Wednesday. It's called In Pursuit of Happiness Research. Is it reliable? What does it imply for policy? And at the same time, we've got the issue of Cato Unbound that I'm editing currently is a happiness issue. We've got a great lineup, including Darren McMahon, who wrote a book called Happiness, a History, Barry Schwartz, who wrote The Paradox of Choice, and a sociologist from the Netherlands named Ruud Veenhoven, who's the editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies, and also keeps the director of the World Database of Happiness. So, despite the fact that I'm, suffering from a bit of a, bacterial malaise, it seems like everything I've been doing these days is somehow happiness related.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you have somebody who edits a journal called the Journal of Happiness Science. I didn't realize that there was somebody, or that there was a field of this sort before I actually saw your Cato Unbound thing.
Yeah, there's the Journal of Happiness Studies. I think it's been around since like 2001. And Veenhoven, who's the editor and also the keeper of the World Database of Happiness, which is a huge compendium of happiness data from all over the world, is one of the world's experts on the empirical evidence of happiness surveys. He's one of the interesting things about the current issue of Cato Unbound is, as you may remember from his book, Barry Schwartz argues that having so many choices, being so wealthy, we have just a huge surplus of choices, and all these choices can cause us a lot of anxiety. So he argues that the relationship between wealth and happiness is not only, there's not only diminishing returns, but there are non-monotonic returns. There can be a point at which you get so wealthy that it starts making you less happy.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, this must be an uncomfortable argument for a libertarian, seeing as presumably libertarianism is all about the maximization of individual choices. What do you think as a libertarian about the validity of this complaint?
Thanks for asking the question, because just in terms of the data, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence to support it. You'll see in Veenhoven's contribution to the Cato Unbound dialogue, he just shows the data from the U.S., the EU8, and Japan over the last 30 years or so. Japan is stagnant, but the U.S. and the EU seem to be steadily increasing their happiness as they grow wealthier over time. More dramatically, Veenhoven has a measure which he calls healthy life years, which is kind of analogous to quality-adjusted life years in public health, where what he does is he takes the expected longevity in a particular country and divides it by one of these happiness scales. He puts it on a scale of 0 to 1. And so he multiplies the longevity by that number and comes up with this, the number of years you can expect to live happily. now because people are living so much longer, but also because people are generally say that they're happy in sort of wealthy liberal democracies, the number of happy life years has expanded quite dramatically. So the picture is actually an optimistic one, as opposed to the one that Schwartz proposes.
Now, when we talked last time, you were pretty skeptical about the empirical validity of some of these measures. How does this play out with the sort of data that Wolfowitz is talking about?
I'm skeptical of. Mostly, he's using the survey. The data that he has is mostly from self-reported happiness. You give people a survey, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 4. People say how happy they think they are on that scale. The whole first half of my new Cato paper is a critique of the methodology, largely of survey-based studies, the attempt to measure happiness through surveys, and I'm pretty skeptical. Now, there are conditions under which I think they can be useful. That at any given time, in any given place, people's answers to those questions probably correlate with something objective. But I am a little bit skeptical of cross-country comparisons and a little bit skeptical of comparisons over time because of there's various reasons to think that people just readjust the standard that they're using to report their own happiness as time goes on, as people's expectations increase. So if anything, I think one of the reasons I'm skeptical is I think the overtime comparisons are likely to deflate or understate the increase in people's sense of well-being over time because of this kind of moving the goalposts kind of phenomenon.
Well, to move on to the second topic, if that's okay, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about this. This actually segues nicely into my apologies, by the way. I'm suffering from a lot of echo here, which is a little distracting, so I may not be quite as articulate as I usually am. But to segue in, one of the things that I have been accused of in the last several days is of a peculiar medical ailment called Goldberg Derangement Syndrome. And where this came about is, I know, this sounds like a very, very serious condition. Where this came about was that Jonah Goldberg had a piece where he argued on the corner, effectively, that the problem with liberal and with conservative takes on economics was that they basically didn't pay enough attention to culture. And so Goldberg's take was that culture, national culture, explained, for example, why Swedes could get away with welfare state and why, for example, United States people could not. So that in his terms, Swedish throne kissers and French throne kissers, which seems like kind of a contradiction in terms, explained why, so you got these cultures of deference in Europe which allowed for welfare states and for social whatever to happen, but that this wasn't true in the US. And this seemed to me to connect into a whole series of very bad social scientific arguments, starting with people like Edward Banfield in the 1960s, who made similarly deterministic arguments about national culture and what it meant, or the specific culture of subgroups, and what it meant for politics, and really seemed to be a very bad argument. But for Goldberg, apparently, this is evidence that I am suffering from this very peculiar and very serious-sounding ailment.
Now, what's your main objection to the sort of culture matters argument? In fact, we had an issue of Cato Unbound several months ago on the relative importance of culture versus institutions versus economic and social policy a few months ago. And we had, what was his name, Lawrence Harrison, arguing for the importance of culture and economic development. It looks like there is quite a literature that supports the idea that certain kinds of cultural norms are necessary to say, get certain kinds of wealth-producing institutions in place and to get them to stick. How is what Jonah is saying, how is that much different from that?
Well, as I understood it, Jonah was making a rather stronger argument. Now, it's hard to say because he engaged in what my co-blogger John Halbo describes as a kind of two-step between an argument which is kind of outrageously strong or a argument which is so weak that nobody could possibly disagree with it. The outrageously strong one here being that effectively these cultures really determine the kinds of choices that can be made in a profound way, and the weak one being that culture matters to some degree, and clearly culture has to matter to some degree. So I don't have any problem with explanations that talk about culture as such. What I do have problems with are explanations that more or less see culture as being fixed and as profoundly limiting the kinds of social choices that you can or can't make. Because very often in history, it seems to me, these kinds of arguments have been associated with basically do-nothing prescriptions, consigning various populations to whatever squalor they're perceived to live in, because the argument goes, these groups have cultures which stop them from achieving what they should achieve, and therefore there's nothing very much that outsiders can do about that. And this seems to me to be not only a cop-out, but to be empirically wrong. Now, that said, I think that there are very good and interesting arguments about culture, but what I like are the kinds of arguments which combine culture with agency, which look at the ways, for example, which individuals are able to use symbols, to shape expectations and so on, in order to change culture and to act as cultural entrepreneurs. And there's a lot of very interesting literature in sociology, to a lesser extent in political science, and even little bits and pieces appearing in economics here and there, which talk to this.
Yeah, well, it was kind of funny when I went through the list of links that you sent me concerning Goldberg Derangement Syndrome. The debate took me back to an incredibly interesting paper that I'd read a year or so ago, a couple years ago, by Alberto Alesina, Ed Glazer, and Bruce Sekerdote, called "Why Doesn't the U.S. Have a European-Style Welfare State?" And you know, the answer is that it's complicated, right? Their answer was that had something to do with the fact that the U.S. back in the 18th century implemented certain kinds of policies that were intended to actually impede the rate of government reform and to protect property especially well. Those institutions stuck over time. They were both an outgrowth of the American culture, and they helped to reinforce certain kinds of cultural norms. While in Europe, they did have a monarchical tradition in many countries, but every single one of the sort of major European countries went through some kind of revolutionary upheaval, domestically, in the way overthrowing the domestic government in a way that the U.S. never did. And in the European countries, most of those governments were they instituted something like proportional democracy, which tends to speed up the rate of policy change, and there was a huge influence of socialists in Europe, which in turn changed the sort of state propaganda. So they argue that there's a kind of a difference in the kind of story that the political elites are feeding to its people about things like their economic opportunity and their possibilities of mobility. But the answer is that they say, of course, culture. One of the things they say, I'll quote just one sentence: monumental differences in history, such as the U.S. Civil War and the open frontier with the West, contributed to create a different climate and attitudes toward the relationship between the individual and the state. So it sounds like they are saying that one of the reasons why the U.S. doesn't have a welfare state is because its history is one that put it on a track to have a culture that has a sort of antipathy to government redistribution. But I agree with you that it's facile to just say, oh, well, it won't work because of culture. But it may, in the same sense, it may be true because the culture is an outgrowth of a whole history and set of institutions and set of policies that have become embedded in the system over time.
Well, here I think there are a couple of differences that are important. First of all, the Alesina and Glazer paper, it's an empirical paper. They try to come up with proofs of their arguments. You can agree or disagree with those proofs, but nonetheless they seem to be based in some sort of a coordinated process of evidence gathering. And secondly, I don't think that anybody in their right mind, apart from maybe some extraordinarily extreme economists, denies that culture matters in a empirical sense. Clearly what people believe, their attitudes, their expectations, all of these things have to be extremely important in understanding, if you want to understand how they actually think and how they actually behave and what their political expectations are. But what I think is the difference here is that we're moving from the empirical to the normative. In other words, we're moving from the statement that America appears to have had this culture at various points in the past, which is an empirical claim, to the normative claim that because of this, it is impossible for America ever to have a set of institutions that in any way approximate the social democratic set of institutions. And indeed, if you look at Goldberg's piece, his initial argument cites Martin Lipset on this. And Lipset, while he goes rather further in the direction of culture explaining a lot of things than I would, for example, he does explicitly acknowledge that we have seen changes over time, as, for example, institutions were introduced in the wake of the New Deal. These led to a more egalitarian economic structure and towards a move, in a certain sense, towards a more European-style culture, which lasted for a while and which then dissipated in his belief as the sort of egalitarianism economically began to kick in. But this is an argument not obviously about culture being some sort of Platonic ideal that exists forever and that is immutable. Instead, it's an argument that a culture is important, but that it can be changed, and providing at least some primitive arguments about the circumstances under which culture can change.
Yeah, well, I mean, wasn't it Patrick Moynihan who said like the central liberal truth is that something to the effect that policy can change culture, and something like, and I forget what the central conservative truth was, but it was something like the inverse of that culture constrains what policies can be effective, and both of those things are kind of obviously right? That if you can succeed in implementing a policy that changes the structure of incentives for individuals, it will lead people to sort of habituate to new patterns of behavior that over time will create different shared expectations and different shared norms. It'll change the culture. At the same time, like, there are certain policies you can try to put in place, and if they don't mesh well enough with the shared set of expectations, the shared norms of the people that you're trying to govern with those policies, they'll fail. And I think Jonah was, I think he was trying to say the latter, don't you think? He was trying to say that you can try to impose something like, was he saying that you would just never be successful in passing this legislation, or that if you passed it, it would fail because it would run against the grain of American culture?
I don't think that Jonah ever got to that level of specificity. I think it was more along the lines of Europeans are throne kissers, Americans are individualists, and therefore we don't want any of your damn European welfare state.
Yeah, well, I don't want any of the damn European welfare state, Henry.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I don't expect to convince you of that. But as long as you accept that this isn't a cultural whatever, and if you do that, I'll grant you the possibility that perhaps Europe can change in a more libertarian direction given appropriate institutional changes and so on.
Let's hope. It looks like it is in some places. Your homeland, Ireland, has a fantastic rate of growth and has done a huge amount of economic liberalization, so good for the Irish.
Well, that also depends. The role that Ireland plays in U.S. policy debates and what actually happened in Ireland are two different things. So that you get this mythology of Ireland as being an extremely liberal economy in the U.S., which has some truth to it. There's certainly a lot of truth to the claim that a lot of Ireland, a lot of Irish economic policy was about tax cuts over the last 10 or 12 years. But also you get these forms of social coordination, which would be more or less unthinkable in the US, between business, trade unions, government, other social partners, which set a framework for social policy, for economic policy and so on, and which I think played a really crucial part in creating the set of stable expectations that allowed Ireland to move on from being the economic basket case that it was in the 1980s into a thriving economy. So the story of
well, obviously
social
you know more
democracy
about
in Ireland.
Ireland than I do.
Yeah. This is something which I guess it's pretty hard for somebody to beat an Irish person unless they are in some way specialised in the Irish economy.
Yeah. Well, I was looking because those links that you sent me about the Goldberg Derangement Syndrome included something from Ezra Klein, which said that European and Scandinavian, or I think he said some Scandinavian countries and some Western European countries had been spending a higher percentage of GDP on government, yet had higher rates of growth in the U.S. And I was like, is that true? And I looked it up, and it doesn't look to me to be true. Only, does Finland count as a Scandinavian country? I guess so.
Finland counts sort of. Brad DeLong had a post he wrote a couple of years ago where he said that Sweden was the big outstanding case where you would expect, where the expectations of economic theory don't seem to work very well. That high state sector involvement seems to have gone along with pretty credible growth over a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sweden is just behind the U.S. I looked at the OECD growth rates for the 5 years between 1998 to 2002, and Sweden is just behind the U.S. Ireland is sort of lapping the pack though, with 8.1 percent rate of economic growth from 98 to 2002.
Well, then it's starting from a much lower basis, and there are two ways you can frame the question. Right? One is why Ireland has grown so rapidly in the last 10 years. The other is why it took it 70 years to get to the point where it could actually start growing economically at a substantive rate and join Western Europe effectively in terms of its economic prosperity.
Yeah, well, excellent. Shall we move on? I think there's probably a link from this last issue to the science issue. You want to introduce the
there's been a pretty interesting debate that's been happening among scientists over the last week or so, which centres on a piece that Chris Mooney is a well-known blogger, and Nisbet wrote for Science, the journal. And effectively what they were arguing was that scientists were doing a pretty lousy job of presenting the case for science in the public arena, and that they needed to do a much better job of framing scientific issues in such a way that people in the general public were liable to understand them and to sympathise with them. And part of the clear underlying message here was that spokespeople for science shouldn't be like Richard Dawkins, who are pretty hostile towards religion in its various forms and arguing that if you're not atheistic, you're dumb. Instead, they should be sort of much more prepared to deal with people as they are and to effectively come up with arguments that are not inclined so much as belittling or dismissing religion as trying to carve out a space for science in the public space and to try and roll back some of the ways in which science has been abused by various bodies over the last 10, 20 years in particular.
Well, were you impressed with the piece?
I basically buy the argument. I mean, it seems to me that there are two possible objections to their line. First is the one which I was surprised to see I haven't seen as much focus upon, which is the argument that science and scientists should be concerned with eternal truths, not with presenting those truths, and to the extent that they start getting concerned with framing, that they're going to lose much of their authority, much of their moral purpose, because they're going to be effectively seeking to spin the truth in ways that are politically convenient. So this is going back to Max Weber. It's the idea that there's a fundamental disconnect between the kinds of things that scientists ought to do and the kinds of things that politicians ought to do. The second possible objection is the one that seems to have gotten more people going, which is the pragmatic objection, with various people disagreeing that it's with Mooney and Nisbet's argument, and saying that it is in fact a good idea to be much more confrontational in the public sphere, and in the words of one of their critics, that Richard Dawkins has done much more to push forward the case for science and for atheism and whatever than has anybody in the last couple of decades, and that this really is the way to go, that you need to have forthright, blunt, frank proponents of the scientific, atheistic, or at least agnostic framework, who basically acknowledge, yeah, it's kind of hard to have God in the same framework if you believe in scientific truth. And it seems to me that the latter doesn't seem to me to work politically. So my guess is, and I don't know that there's any firm evidence for this, that people like Dawkins, they certainly do a lot to energize the people out there who agree with them and to turn them into a constituency, but they also do a lot to turn off people who might potentially be interested in hearing the scientific case on things like evolution and whatever, but who find themselves being turned off because they're basically being told that people like them who are perhaps Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever are by definition excluded from these from the scientific worldview because of their basic value attachments to the existence of God and so on.
I don't know. I actually found the piece, I think, a little vacuous.
Yeah.
All it seemed to me to say is that rhetoric matters. That if you're trying to persuade something to somebody, you should pay attention to who your audience is and use language that they find persuasive. There's a good blog post by a guy named Greg Layden. I think he's a biologist of some sort, and we'll put the link by by our little video here. But he actually argues that they don't even seem to. He thought it was kind of embarrassing because he thought that the editors of Science let some guys come in and talk about framing, and they didn't seem to understand what the scientific state of the art about framing was, and thought they were abusing the very idea. And Layden was saying that, like, in the classical sense, which I guess goes back to Irving Goffman, is what he was claiming, that a frame is just a whole framework of understanding, and that the scientific frame, the frame of evidence and argument and sort of probability and uncertainty and experiment and all of that is one big frame. And that the argument against science is that the sort of anti-science folks are trying to get people to not adopt that sort of materialistic, empirical, open-minded frame that's part of the scientific worldview. Mooney and what was the other guy's name?
Nisbet.
Yeah, Mooney. They seem to me a little bit too obsessed with how to sell particular results to the public, rather than how to gain more adherence to the overall sort of scientific picture of the world, and the particular results that they seem to pick are ones that I'm afraid that they had some sort of political hobby horse to ride about, and so I was just a little bit suspicious of whether they were saying, hey, we have to get better at spinning these particular empirical results because we need the public to accept them in order to implement a political program that we like, as opposed to saying, here's what we need to do to build more public confidence in the scientific way of thinking. And so I found it either a little bit vacuous in just saying that rhetoric matters, or a little bit questionable in that it seemed to be have a little bit of its own not exactly scientific agenda to it.
Okay, well, to respond to these things in turn, first of all, as to the charge that it's vacuous, I think that this is very much a capsule argument, because I really want to see, they say that they're working on a much longer version of this, and I want to see what they have to say in that, because clearly there's a lot of stuff missing from their argument. But I also don't think it's vacuous, because pretty clearly it's managed to rouse a pretty heated reaction from a whole bunch of different people, attacking it on a whole bunch of different grounds. So I don't think that this is necessarily perceived verities or whatever. I think what they're saying is somewhat controversial in scientific circles, and my guess is that's why the editor of Science decided to publish them. So I think that it's not vacuous. But that said, I do think that there is that the second issue you identify is maybe a little more interesting, which is the issue that in order to try and persuade people of science, you don't just need to persuade them that evolution is important. You need to persuade them of a whole underlying view of the universe about how it is that you test, how it is that you use evidence, hypotheses, falsification, if you want to use the Popper type of language or whatever. All of these things which are part of a culture, part of a frame. And certainly they could do a lot more to talk about that. But the point here is, I think, that many scientists assume that this is necessarily the base of public political argument. And unfortunately it's not. So the question you're faced with then is, when a majority of the public doesn't really buy this kind of stuff, how do you persuade them that they should be going for this kind of evidence-based scientific reasoning? And it seems to me that that necessarily is not a scientific project. It's not something where you can just demonstrate and you can point and say, look, we are scientists, this is necessarily the one true way of doing things. I think you do have to engage in some sort of political rhetoric in order to persuade people into that viewpoint. And so the question is, what kinds of rhetoric, what kinds of things you do in order to do that? And as for the third thing, the specifics that they focus on, maybe they have a broader political agenda here, maybe not. But these are the things that are most, I think, controversial in the public debate at the moment, precisely because you have a whole bunch of people who disagree strongly with the ideas of evolution, of global warming, and whatever. And while you might sort of dispute the specific policy results that ought to come from these scientific debates, I think that the scientific evidence for evolution is about as ironclad as you could possibly hope for a theory of its kind. And the scientific evidence for global warming, while there's still a lot of uncertainty about the precise place that we're likely to end up along a spectrum of possibilities, the scientific evidence is that man-made global warming is almost certainly going to be responsible for substantial changes in the climate, and we've got to begin to figure out how to deal with that and move on from the earlier debate with the sort of various controversies with people, including, frankly, a bunch of hacks like that guy McKittrick, who couldn't get his scientific terminology of radiance and so on into shape. We have to move on from questioning the fundamentals of the science to, on the one hand, the more nuanced scientific debates about which part of the spectrum of possible end states we're going to end up along, and then to the policy debate about what do we do about it given that we are where we are. And so when I see Ronald Bailey, for example, deciding to sign on to the global warming is a fact, this seems to me to be a pretty strong signal that it is a fact, and that even people whose ideological druthers would persuade them in the opposite direction are coming to acknowledge that you've got to talk about this if you want to be taken seriously in these debates.
Well, it's funny. One of the articles about the Mooney and Nisbet article that I looked at was by John Hawkes, who's an anthropologist, and he was skeptical of scientists getting in the business of spinning their results in a way that would be, especially palatable to the public by, maybe by playing into their biases. And one of the things that he mentioned is a recent Ron Bailey article on the way the scientific consensus frame is used in scientific rhetoric. And he just pointed out a consistency among some environmentalists where the scientific consensus, I don't know if it's accurate to call it a frame, but the consensus gambit, that all respectable scientists believe this, and therefore if you don't, you're just basically backwards. That gambit seems not to bother, say, Greenpeace or other environmental organizations when it comes to something like genetically modified foods, where the scientific consensus is overwhelming that there is no particular expected harm that's going to come about from genetic modification of foods, yet these same groups who use the consensus cudgel for global warming just completely ignore the consensus because for some reason they have some beef about GM foods. And Hawkes' point about the Bailey article was he was seeing Bailey as some kind of science skeptic, I think, because he had been skeptical of global warming. I don't think that's right about where Ron's coming from. But he used that as an example. See, like, the skeptical types of people can use these framing things again. And I'm not sure what Hawkes was saying, that, like, because he seemed to... because he seemed to have some sort of suspicion of Bailey's argument about what the consensus was with respect to genetically modified foods. But the broader concern, I think, that was in his blog post was that this is a game that anybody can play, and if you sort of set the precedent of getting into a spinning game, your skeptics are going to they're going to feel less constrained by the norms of scientific inquiry and will be even more craven in using those rhetorical devices to spin their political agenda vis-a-vis the whatever they say the scientific results. And that's a game that scientists won't win, because scientists are rightly bound by a bunch of norms of how to talk about things and how to how to inquire into empirical issues. And so he thought, I think what he was saying is that it may be dangerous for scientists to set that kind of precedent of playing the game of framing and spinning their results.
Well, I think there's a difference here between framing and spinning. And,
yeah.
Okay, definitionally, I'm not sure that I can come up with a hard and fast definition, but it seems to me to be perfectly legit for scientists to think about how best to present the case for a specific body of scientific evidence, so that when it has important public consequences, so that this body of scientific evidence is understood by the public and has some political consequences along the lines that are suggested by whatever the evidence is. I think that that's a very different thing from, for example, from seeking to distort your findings, seeking to say what's true, claiming that things are true that aren't true, or that are only possibly supported by the scientific evidence. I think that's a whole different kettle of fish. And pretty clearly, groups like Greenpeace on the one side, and I'm sure that you can think about the various junk science, Stephen Milloy people on the other, people who are seeking to spin the scientific debates in one way or another, clearly very often do go for kinds of presentation and inconsistencies, and in unfortunate cases, sometimes outright dishonesties that are completely antithetical to what scientists ought to be doing. But as for the broader question, scientists are losing this game. They're losing the ability to present scientific evidence in public and to have that accepted as having some validity in and of itself. Now, maybe this is not entirely a bad thing. If you look back to the 50s and 60s, the kinds of respect which scientists were held in maybe was a bit unthinking and unconsidering, and there was a kind of glamour there to the idea of science.
Priesthood and lab coats.
Yeah, exactly. The guys in lab coats presenting things in TV advertisements to tell you that this would wash 10 times whiter than the competing product and whatever, were clearly parasitic upon that. But, so there was this kind of unthinking reverence for science, which maybe didn't recognize how partial, how tricky, how complicated a process finding scientifically valid findings actually are. But nonetheless, if you look at the debate today, there's a very strong presumption when you look at some things, which has been, I think, politically manufactured, that for example, when scientists talk about global warming, you have people like James Imhoff basically saying that they're part of a left-wing conspiracy
which is seeking to undermine sort of American this, that, and the other. And you have authors like Michael Crichton effectively sort of writing bestsellers, which are all about evil environmentalist terrorists seeking world domination through scaring the hell out of people and blowing things up. And if scientists are going to try and combat this, I think just presenting themselves meekly is not going to get there. I think they have to be much more aggressive. I think they have to be much more canny about how they present themselves in public. Clearly they cannot ever traduce their basic scientific responsibility, which is to the truth as best they understand it. But nonetheless, they need to think about the ways in which evidence can be presented in one way or another, and which the case for thinking about things scientifically can be presented one way or the other, in order to persuade people to to a more evidence-based form of reasoning.
Henry, when you were saying that, it was making me think. One of the things that bothers me, that bothered me about the piece in Science was, I guess one of the things that because part of the point, one of the implicit points was clearly that accurately that whether or not people accept key findings of science is going to have an effect on public policy, and that's undeniably true. What people believe to be true is going to affect what kinds of policies they're going to support. But often when I see scientists, especially people who are very, very passionate about global warming or about the environment in particular seems to be an area that locks into some people's moral value system in a way that makes them passionate about conveying the information beyond whatever just the dry scientific data. People don't just get up and say, okay, here are the number of here are all the different range of climate models that we have, and these different models predict changes in temperature within these ranges, and this is the range that we find most probable. That people don't just say that, and part of the reason I think they don't is because people have the sense that if the general public accepts, say, global warming, then they'll also accept a particular package of policies, like being in favor of signing on to the Kyoto Protocol, or being in favor of putting a large tax on carbon emissions or something like that. That those things would follow straightforwardly from people accepting that scientific fact. The problem that I have when I see scientists very sort of politically adamant about the importance of their result is that often those scientists don't actually understand what the real policy implications of their results would be. They don't they are not themselves scientists who specialize in the science of human coordination, how it is that political systems can generate good results, and so on and so forth. So sometimes they draw the political implication of their scientific finding a little too slickly or facilely, and I think a lot of times the denialists of various things are just people who are trying to stop that inference, partly because they know that the argument that they have to make about why this policy doesn't follow from that empirical fact is too complicated to make to the public. Did you follow what I was saying?
I did, but that's kind of, I think, letting off the people who deny global warming, for example, as an important factor a little too easily, because what it is saying is that on the one hand we have naive scientists who don't understand what the policy implications of what they say are, and on the other hand we have people who do understand policy implications and who feel that it's justifiable in a sense to be actively, publicly dishonest about the science in order to fight back things that they disagree with. And this may be true.
I think they're both wrong. They're both wrong.
But it seems to me that the latter is rather more suspect than the former, in that the former you can presumably do education work. The former doesn't corrupt public debate in the same way that the latter does. Because the former is about stuff which is correctable, which is to say that scientists, assuming that they're arguing in good faith, that there's a reasonable chance that you can actually get them to agree, well, if you show them this evidence and that evidence, that maybe the public policy prescriptions that they naively believed were the right ones may turn out not to be the right ones. And this can conduct towards a genuinely useful public debate. But where you have people whose first instinct on going into that debate is bluntly to lie about what the science says because what the science says is politically inconvenient for them, then that public debate doesn't happen in the first place. And that, for me, and I think for anybody who believes in the possibilities of democratic debate, imperfect as it is, that's a fundamental problem.
Agreed. What I would like to see with scientists, and this is the thing. I mean, this is like when it comes to politics and when it comes to moral issues, everybody thinks that they're an expert, and in some sense, they're. If you live in a representative democracy where everybody has a vote, of course your opinion counts, right? Your opinion actually helps determine policy, and everybody likes to think that they're an expert in policy. People don't get to determine what the conclusion of scientific inquiry is going to be, but people do get to determine within certain limits what public policy is going to be implemented in the long run. But it seems like to me that people that I agree. Trying to frame my point, I think it's a huge problem that people don't have. I don't think I agree with you that it might be a good thing that people's deference to the norms of science have eroded. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think one of the most important things for the sort of like progress of humanity is that more and more and more people respect the norms of rational inquiry and the methods of truth finding. I think that's just...
Can I just break in here? Because I actually think we're probably not disagreeing here as much as you think. What I'm saying, I guess, is that I think back in the 50s and 60s, insofar as I understand these things, I'm not a sociologist of the era, that what the problem was that people had a deference towards science while not necessarily understanding it. In other words, that they weren't skeptical about scientific results under some circumstances where they should have been skeptical, and where they should have understood that the basis of science is indeed skepticism. So,
So there's a kind of rhetoric of science that like the guy in the white lab coat comes out and says, 9 out of 10, physicists agree that handy wash washes your dishes. Yeah, but and I agree with that. So I think we're agreed that it's very important that most people understand and sort of respect the norms of scientific inquiry better than they do. But I think part of that is other scientists realizing where their expertise gives out and it's time to hand it over to somebody else. That here's my data on the global warming models. And then when it comes to what the best policy solution is, why would they have anything in particular to say unless they also specialize in economics or in political science or some field that might be able to make some kind of reasonable prediction about what the various consequences of different policies would be. So I think part of a deepening respect for the norms of science is a deepening respect for the scientific division of labor. But I think a lot of scientists don't really think of policy, don't really think of economics as real sciences, so they feel a little more free to opine than I think they perhaps should.
Okay, I think I could accept that. Being a political scientist, obviously, who's jealous for the boundaries of his field, I could certainly accept that. But I think I'd point in a slightly different direction than the one that you would, which is that basically this is an argument on your behalf for scientific modesty, for saying, here are the results, go away and do whatever you as experts in public policy, in economics or whatever, believe are the right things to do, go away and do these things, and there's not very much more that we can contribute to the process. And what this seems to me instead to perhaps be signalling is that rather than scientists doing this, they should be engaging more directly in public debate with people in public policy, in economics, in sociology and political science in different ways, and actually trying to figure out more directly through debate back and forth about how to do this, because there's clearly a lot that political scientists and economists can learn from scientists about how the likely prescriptions that they're likely to have are going to play out in scientific terms. And this is something which I think there isn't very much in the way of institutional support for in the US. We have the National Academy of Sciences tries to do some of this stuff, but is, I think, under-resourced and doesn't perhaps necessarily have all of the connections with the social sciences that it would like to have. And this is perhaps the level on which we want to have expert debate happening. Of course, that's a little bit different from the public debate, which is what Mooney and Nisbet are talking about. But nonetheless, I think you're basically right about that, although, as I say, I would push this in the direction of more debate between scientists and other people.
I think we're agreed. I mean, I think we can agree that part of it ought to be there ought to be more of a dialogue between social scientists and hard scientists who are involved in things that are relevant to politics and policy. And part of the point of that would be to help hard scientists become more literate in the sort of social scientific way of thinking, so that their opinions about so that they could actually contribute more productively to debates about about policy. Because one of the things that's keeping, say, physicists or climate scientists from being very useful contributors is their sort of lack of understanding of the analytical tools that social scientists bring to bear. So I think if their sort of economic literacy, political scientific literacy was brought up a few notches, that would really improve the nature of the public discourse about the policy implications of scientific findings.
One final point on this, which is that I think both social scientists and scientists more generally are faced with a major problem over the next 10 to 20 years with dealing with a bunch of these issues, which is that we're talking about complex systems, feedbacks, all of these things which are very, very difficult to predict very successfully in advance. And that's one of the problems with climate change, of course, that we're basically reliant on models where the predictions are going to vary according to the parameters that you set the models up with. And more generally, this is a big problem, I think, for public debate over these issues, because on the one hand, clearly we have a whole bunch of issues, not only scientific issues, but also public policy issues, which have these kinds of features, which have feedback, which have complexity, where you can make sort of broad middle-range estimates as to likely outcomes, but it's very hard to come up with clear if X then Y kinds of statements. And these are clearly problems which are emerging, which are important, but which neither scientists nor social scientists are well equipped to deal with, and which is very hard to galvanize public debate around. And this is something which one of my colleagues, Leon First, who used to be Al Gore's national security advisor and is now concerned with this thing that he calls, what's his word again? I'm trying to remember. Anyway, he's trying to galvanize the policy process and figure out how do you change policy processes to deal with complicated long-term threats so that they can respond appropriately, not over-responding in advance, not just putting things onto the long finger, but somehow managing to create political responses that stop off some of these problems before they become big ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that there really is. I mean, in some sense, a lot of what the so-called science is, when you're talking about global warming and public policy, it's the same science, right? The way you build a model and then extrapolate, the way you fit a curve of past data points and then use that to extrapolate into the future it's the exact same math in climate science as it is in sort of macroeconomic forecasting, where you're trying to figure out what the growth rate is going to be so many years from now, given all the variables that you understand to be inputs to the growth rate and what the sort of feedback loops are and so forth. So in a lot of ways, there already is a common vocabulary between certain kinds of social scientists and certain kinds of people involved in environmental and biological science. But see, the thing, and I think it would be useful if the public understood more of the complexity of the issues that arise in model building and in predicting long-term trends in complex systems. But if you bring up the difficulty of doing that, a lot of crap will rain down on your head about trying to undermine people's confidence in the findings of climate science. So in some ways, just open discussion about the difficulties of modeling complex systems, a lot of very scientifically respectable people encourage you not to have that discussion out in the open.
Well, the other side of that is that very often the uncertainty is invoked as an excuse for doing nothing. And when you have uncertainty, but where you have a reasonable belief that there is a strong set of negative possible things that are going to happen in the future, we have to figure out ways in which policy can actually respond to this without over-responding. And I think that the temptation on the other side, and this is especially true, we see this with the tobacco lobby and that infamous memo about how the goal was to basically inject uncertainty into the debate. We see how it is that this can be used as an excuse for doing nothing, even when it's pretty blindingly apparent that there's a major problem out there that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah. Well, agreed. Is our time up, or do we have
we've got
2 minutes for Wolfowitz?
We've got a few minutes for Wolfowitz, I think. So what's your take? Does he stay or does he go?
I think he should get canned.
Yeah.
Myself. I never liked the guy. He is partly responsible for the quagmire in Iraq, which should lead us to not be very charitable. But the huge thing is just the irony of the scandal that he's accused of basically getting a big raise for his girlfriend while his big keynote initiative in the World Bank is being against corruption, right? And it just seems like you kind of sap yourself of all your and corruption is just a huge problem in developing countries. It saps places of their abilities to build quality institutions, to have a stable rule of law, to create sort of robust, complex markets. Just corruption can just take the wind out of any economy's sails. So it's an important initiative, and you have to have some high ground to stand on. And I think he just cut himself off at the kneecaps. I just don't see how how he hasn't really lost his whatever moral authority he still had.
I think that's right. I was actually a little less down on him when he joined and when he went to the World Bank, and that it seemed to me that he was one of the more honest people among the neocons. He was a little crazy when it came to World Trade Center and Laurie Milroy kind of stuff, but that he actually was somebody who was a sincere actor to some extent and might be able to do some good stuff and at least would do less harm there than he was doing elsewhere. And unfortunately,
that's what I thought when he was appointed too.
Yeah, but unfortunately, clearly that's turned out to be wrong. And I think part of this turns on the definition of corruption. I've just come up from a morning session with Susan Rose Ackerman and Kaufman from the World Bank and Mark Warren, all talking about corruption. And so this was purely coincidence that it happened today. But it seems to me that part of the problem was that Wolfowitz probably didn't perceive what he was doing as necessarily corrupt, because it's by and large it's accepted practice in U.S. politics. So if you bring in people, when you come into the administration, you bring in your ideological friends, you give them substantial whacks of money, which is what he did with a bunch of people he brought in from the Republican side into the World Bank, to much resentment among conventional staffers, and you look after your own people to the extent that you can without breaking the formal rules. And it doesn't seem so far that there's evidence that Wolfowitz has indubitably broken the formal rules. It may be that he's actually managed to sneak around them somehow, but clearly what he's done is incompatible with his role as somebody who ought to be a fighter against corruption, and I think is arguably being corrupt in a broader sense. This is something where he has abused his discretion for private gain, for the gain of his girlfriend, and this is something which I think is pretty unconscionable in a politician in general, and specifically in somebody who occupies the role that he's supposed to be occupying.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, And my general perspective is that government institutions that they all tend to create this kind of space for cronyism of different sorts, and that it does tend to have a corrupting influence. And you're probably right that he was playing the game as it's played, but that's an indictment of the game, and it's one of those things that if that's the way the World Bank is, or if that's the way the State Department is, and they want to tell other countries to clean up their act, then it's a case of doctor, heal yourself, right? Like, that if you're going to if you're going to demand that other people have political processes that are more reliable and trustworthy and more meritocratic and more transparent, then you really have to be an example of that in order to expect to have any effectiveness or authority. So I think in that sense, he just really undermined himself extremely badly, which is probably going to make him ineffectual. And the thing is, I kind of fear who would replace Wolfowitz. I'm not sure that the next guy is actually going to be better in terms of bank policy, because I think it needs a lot of reform, and I think Wolfowitz is actually on the right track for some of those reforms. So I don't know that the next person is going to be better, but I think Wolfowitz has kind of ruined his chance to be effective.
I agree. I think I'll link to a paper by Mark Warren, which I think talks about exactly these broader definitions of corruption that are needed. But I'm also worried about who's going to be appointed. Any bets on John Bolton or Douglas Weiss? So the mind basically squirbles at the thought of various people who might be nominated.
Anything is possible. Maybe Alberto Gonzalez. Yeah, anything's possible at this point. So I'll just hope for the best.
Okay, well, I think I'm running out of time here. So great talking to you again, Will.
Great talking to you as always, Henry.
And hopefully
it looks like I survived our hour.
We did indeed.
Let's do it again soon.
And hopefully you recover a little bit from some of the illnesses and find the happiness that is your due.
Well, thank you. Likewise, and stay out of the wind.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.